Okay, so today we're diving into something that's probably like super relevant to everyone listening, especially if you're, all about trying to learn new things quickly and effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And, with the internet and everything, it's like we have so much information at our fingertips, right?
It's crazy.
It really is. But the thing is, just having access to all that information doesn't automatically make us amazing learners, right?
No, not at all. It's like having a super fancy sports car, but not actually knowing how to drive stick.
Exactly. So that's kind of what we're digging into today, the whole idea of self regulated learning, or SRL for short.
SRO. Okay, so that's basically, the skills and strategies that help you learn effectively on your own, especially in online environments.
Right. And we're talking about computer based learning environments specifically, or as the researchers call them, CBLEs.
CBLEs, guys. So that's everything from online courses to like interactive websites, those simulations you were talking about.
Yeah, all those things. And they're awesome. But the thing is, a lot of people struggle to really get the most out of them, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I think we've all been there. Like you
Yeah.
sign up for this amazing online course thinking it's going to be life-changing,
Right.
and then you end up, you know, getting distracted or feeling overwhelmed by all the
Oh,
information.
totally. And that's where SRL comes in. That's kind of the key to unlocking the full potential of CBLEs.
Okay, so if we get good at SRL, we can actually learn more effectively in these digital environments.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to unpack today, what the research tells us about SRL and how it can help us all become better online learners.
Awesome. And just to give everyone a sense of how deep we're going, we actually looked at a review of 33 different studies on this topic. So
Yeah.
buckle up.
Yeah, we're going deep.
We are. So let's start with like the learner themselves. What do these studies say about the characteristics of successful online learners?
Well, one thing that really stands out is how differently successful learners approach CBLEs compared to those who don't make as much progress.
Okay, so it's not just about being smart. It's about how you approach the learning itself.
Exactly. And there's this really cool research by Azevedo and his colleagues where they use something called think aloud protocols.
Think aloud protocols. So they're basically asking people to like talk out loud about what they're thinking while they're learning.
Yeah, exactly. So they had students working through different CBLEs, like hypermedia environments and simulations, and they basically asked them to narrate their thought process as they went.
That's so interesting. I imagine that gives you like a really direct window into how people's minds work when they're trying to learn new stuff.
Yeah, and what they found was super interesting. The learners who were making the biggest learning gains were the ones who were much more active and strategic in their approach. They didn't just passively consume the information.
Okay, so what were they doing differently?
Well, for one, they spent more time planning before they even started learning, like thinking about what they wanted to achieve and how they were going to approach the material.
Okay, so they had a game plan going in.
Exactly. They were also much better at monitoring their understanding as they went, like stopping to summarize what they've learned and making sure they were actually getting it.
Got it. So they weren't just kind of blindly clicking through the content. They were actually stopping to think about it and process it.
Exactly. And they were also really good at making connections and drawing inferences, like actively trying to relate the new information to what they already knew and figuring out the bigger picture.
Okay, so it's all about that active engagement, really digging into the material and not just skimming the surface.
Totally. And on the flip side, the learners who weren't as successful, they tended to do a lot more help seeking and trying to control the learning environment itself.
Okay, so they were like messing around with the settings or constantly asking for help instead of really grappling with the content itself.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like they were more focused on the mechanics of the CBLE than on the actual learning.
So it's almost like they were getting sidetracked by all the bells and whistles.
You could say that, and this pattern wasn't just limited to older learners. They saw the same thing with younger students, too. For example, they found that gifted middle school students who were really successful in CBLEs, they were using these same effective strategies like summarizing and inferring way more often than their peers who weren't as successful.
Okay, so it's not just about like innate ability or intelligence. It's about using these specific strategies that help you regulate your learning.
Exactly. And these findings even extend to like higher education too. There was a study on grad students taking web-based courses, and they found that the students who were really good at adapting their SRL strategies to this online context, they also tended to have higher self-efficacy, which is basically your belief in your ability to learn and succeed.
Self-efficacy, right? So if you believe you can do it, you're more likely to actually do it.
Exactly. And they also tended to have more of a mastery goal orientation, meaning they were focused on really understanding the material, not just getting a good grade. And they were generally more interested in the subject matter, too.
So it's like all these things are kind of interconnected. Your beliefs about yourself, your goals and your level of interest all play a role in how well you self-regulate your learning.
Absolutely. And this all ties back to Zimmerman's model of SRL, which basically describes learning as this cyclical process where you're constantly planning, trying out strategies, monitoring your progress, reflecting on what worked and what didn't, and then using that information to adjust your approach for the next time.
Okay, so it's a continuous loop of learning and refining your learning process.
Exactly. And another really important factor in all of this is prior knowledge, like how much you already know about the subject matter before you even start learning.
Right. That makes sense. Intuitively, if you're already familiar with the topic, you're probably going to have an easier time picking up new information.
Exactly. And the research backs that up. Studies have shown that learners with high prior knowledge, they tend to do more planning up front, and they're better at monitoring their understanding as they go along.
So they're kind of like building on a solid foundation.
Exactly. And they're also more likely to have what's called an internal locus of control, which means they believe they have control over their own learning.
Okay, so they feel empowered to take charge of their own learning journey.
Exactly. Now, things get a bit more complicated when we look at learners with low prior knowledge. They might actually use more learning strategies overall, but often they're not the most effective strategies.
Okay, so it's like they're trying harder, but not necessarily smarter.
Yeah, they might focus more on things like summarizing and note-taking, which are good strategies, but they're not as effective for deep understanding as things like making inferences or elaborating on the information.
So it's like they're missing out on those higher level thinking skills that really help you internalize the material.
Exactly. And research also suggests that they might have a harder time seeing the connections between different concepts in a hypermedia environment, for example.
So it's like they're getting lost in the forest because they don't have the same mental map as someone who already knows the terrain.
That's a great analogy, and this all highlights the importance of activating prior knowledge. Even if you think you don't know much about the subject, taking some time to think about what you do know can really help you make sense of the new information.
That's a great tip. And it kind of segues nicely into something you mentioned earlier, self-efficacy, that belief in your ability to learn and succeed. How does that tie into all of this?
So when we talk about self-efficacy for SRL specifically, we're talking about your belief in your ability to manage your own learning process within a CBLE, like your confidence in your ability to monitor your understanding, set goals, plan your learning activities, even adapt your learning environment to suit your needs.
Okay, so it's like that feeling of, I got this, I can figure this out, but specifically in the context of online learning.
Exactly. And research shows that self-efficacy for SRL is super important. It's been linked to things like higher academic self-efficacy in general, more frequent use of learning strategies, and even greater confidence in using the internet as a learning tool.
Wow, so it's not just a feeling, it actually has a real impact on how you learn.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that some studies suggest that this relationship between self-efficacy and SRL might be influenced by factors like your parents' education level.
Really, so like your background and upbringing can actually affect how confident you feel about learning online.
It seems that way. There was this one study that found that second-generation college students, they reported having higher self-efficacy for SRL skills in internet learning compared to first-generation students.
Huh. That's fascinating. And it kind of makes sense, right? Like if you've grown up around people who are comfortable with technology and online learning, you're probably going to feel more confident about it yourself.
Exactly. And it just highlights how all these different factors can kind of interplay and influence how we approach learning in these digital environments.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about the learner and their characteristics. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the learning tasks themselves. How do the characteristics of the task influence SRL in CBLEs?
That's a great question. And the research shows that the way a task is designed can really impact how learners approach it. For example, the goal structure that's presented, like whether the task emphasizes mastering the content or performing well, that can influence how much planning learners do.
Okay, so if the focus is on like getting a good grade, people might be more motivated to plan carefully.
Yeah, that's what one study found students who had a performance avoidance goal, meaning they were really trying to avoid looking incompetent. They actually engaged in more planning than students who didn't have that goal.
Interesting. So it's like the fear of failure can actually be a motivator in some cases.
Yeah, maybe they were just trying to be extra careful to make sure they didn't mess up.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about different types of goals, like process goals versus product goals?
So process goals are all about the learning process itself, like focusing on understanding the material and developing your skills, whereas product goals are more about the end result, like getting a good grade or creating a finished product.
Okay, so process is about the journey and product is about the destination.
Exactly. And research has shown that having a process goal orientation can actually lead to higher self-efficacy and more use of SRL strategies compared to having a product goal orientation.
Really? So it's like if you're focused on the learning itself, you're more likely to be successful.
That's what the research suggests, and it makes sense, right? If you're enjoying the process of learning and you're not just stressed about the outcome, you're probably going to be more engaged and motivated.
Totally. Now, you mentioned earlier that learners tend to adjust their plans and goals when the complexity of a task changes. What's the research say about that?
So, as you might expect, when a task gets more challenging, learners have to adapt their approach. And what's interesting is that students who have more sophisticated epistemological beliefs, meaning they have a more nuanced understanding of what knowledge is and how learning works, they tend to be better at judging task complexity and adjusting their goals and plans accordingly.
Okay, so if you understand that learning isn't always straightforward and that different tasks require different approaches, you're going to be better equipped to handle those challenging situations.
Exactly. And another important aspect of task characteristics is a learner control, like how much freedom learners have to choose their own path within the CBLE.
Where a lot of online learning environments give you those options, like you
Yeah.
can choose which modules to do first or which resources to explore.
Exactly. And the research suggests that the optimal level of learner control actually depends on the individual learner's SRL skills.
Okay, so more freedom isn't always better.
Right. If you have low SRL skills, too much freedom can actually be overwhelming. You might end up feeling lost and unsure of what to do next.
So in that case, a more structured environment might actually be more beneficial.
Exactly. On the other hand, if you have high SRL skills, you're probably going to thrive in an environment where you have more control over your learning. You can choose the path that best suits your needs and interests.
So it's all about finding that right balance between structure and freedom.
Exactly, and some studies have even found that highly self-regulated learners, they can actually be hindered by overly structured linear hypermedia environments because they don't allow for enough exploration and independent learning.
So it's like putting a bird in a cage.
Yeah, and conversely, learners with low SRL skills, they might struggle in really open-ended nonlinear environments because they need more guidance and a clearer path.
Makes sense. So it's a real design challenge for creators of CBLEs to find that sweet spot.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about learner characteristics and task characteristics. Now let's move on to another really important aspect of SRL and CBLE's collaborative learning.
Right. Learning doesn't always have to be a solo endeavor. A lot of CBLEs incorporate opportunities for students to work together.
Exactly. And collaborative learning can be really beneficial, but it also introduces a whole new set of dynamics when it comes to SRO.
Okay, so how does self-regulation work when you're learning with other people?
Well, one thing that research has shown is that collaboration can sometimes come at a cost to individual learning. For example, there was this study where they had students with high prior knowledge working with students with low prior knowledge, and they found that the high knowledge students actually learned less individually when they were collaborating.
Really? So it's like they were so focused on helping their partners that they weren't able to learn as much themselves.
Yeah, it's like they were taking on the role of the teacher more than the learner.
Makes sense. And what about when you have pairs of low-achieving students working together?
So, studies have shown that in those situations, the students might not engage in as much high level SRL. They might focus more on basic strategies like following instructions or searching for information, and they might not do a lot of joint planning or monitoring of their shared understanding.
So it's not a given that just putting students together in a CVLE is going to lead to them using these sophisticated SRL strategies.
Right. Collaborative learning can definitely involve what we call mutual regulation, which is where learners work together to stay on track and use cognitive strategies, but it might not always promote strong individual SRL skill.
Okay, so it's not a magic bullet.
Exactly. However, some longer-term studies have shown that collaborative learning in CBLEs can actually lead to improvements in planning and monitoring skills over time, and they've also suggested that these collaborative digital environments might be better at promoting deep processing strategies compared to traditional classroom settings.
Okay, so the effectiveness of collaborative learning seems to depend a lot on how it's structured and the specific characteristics of the learners involved.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important question. How can we actually enhance SRL and CBLEs through different kinds of support?
Right. That's the million-dollar question. We know SRL is important, but how do we actually get better at it, especially in these digital environments?
So researchers have been exploring this question for a while now, and they've identified a few key types of support that can be really helpful support tools, conceptual support, and metacognitive support.
Okay, let's break those down one by one. Starting with support tools. What are we talking about here?
So support tools are basically features that are built into CBLEs that are designed to help learners self-regulate their learning.
Okay, so like note-taking functions, highlighting tools, things like that.
Exactly. And when students are asked about these tools, they generally say that they perceive them as being helpful for various aspects of SRL, like setting goals, seeking help, evaluating their progress, managing their time, using learning strategies, monitoring their understanding.
Okay, so on the surface, it seems like a good thing.
Yeah. But here's the catch. When researchers actually look at how students use these tools in practice, they often find a disconnect.
Really, so students might say they find the tools helpful, but they're not actually using them that much.
Exactly. And this highlights the issue of poor calibration, which is basically the difference between how you think you're doing and how you're actually doing.
So like, you might think you're using a certain learning strategy really effectively, but in reality, you're not.
Exactly. And this can make it really hard to improve your SRL skills because you're not getting accurate feedback on your performance.
That's so frustrating. It's like trying to shoot a basketball in the dark. You don't know if you're even close to the hoop.
Exactly. So that's why it's so important to not just rely on your own self-assessment, but to actually look at the data on how you're using these tools and to be open to feedback from others.
Great point. Okay, so support tools can be helpful, but only if they're used effectively. Now, what about conceptual support?
So conceptual support is all about helping learners understand the subject matter itself. It can include things like providing an outline of the topics, offering guiding questions, presenting visual aids, basically anything that helps the learners make sense of the material.
Okay, so it's kind of like giving them a map of the territory before they start exploring.
Exactly. And research has shown that these kinds of static conceptual scaffolds can actually increase planning behaviors before learners start a task.
So they're more likely to think about their goals and how they're going to approach the material.
Right, but interestingly, static conceptual supports don't seem to have a big impact on monitoring or strategy use during the task itself.
So it's like they help you get started, but they don't necessarily help you navigate once you're on your way.
Yeah, and that's where adaptive scaffolding comes in.
Adaptive scaffolding. Okay, so that's where the level and type of support are adjusted based on the learner's individual needs as they go.
Exactly, and this is often provided by a human tutor who can provide personalized feedback and guidance in real time.
Okay, so it's like having a personal coach for your learning.
Exactly, and studies have shown that adaptive scaffolding can lead to greater learning gains and increased use of planning, monitoring, and effective learning strategies.
Wow, so it's really powerful stuff.
It is, and it just highlights the importance of providing learners with the right support at the right time.
Totally. Now let's move on to the last type of support, metacognitive support. How can CBLEs help us think about our own thinking?
So one really promising approach is a method called Improve-E, which stands for Introducing New Knowledge Reviewing and Organizing, Activating Prior Knowledge Monitoring Comprehension, Elaborating and Generating and Evaluating Learning.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
I know, right? But it's basically a training technique that teaches learners to ask themselves specific questions throughout the learning process, questions that focus on understanding, connecting the information to what they already know, thinking about, which learning strategies to use, and reflecting on their learning experience.
Okay, so it's all about making the learning process more conscious and deliberate.
Exactly. And studies have shown that Improve can have really positive effects on learning outcomes in CBLEs, for example. It's been shown to improve math literacy strategy use and even interest in online learning for middle school students.
That's awesome, and it makes sense, right? If you're actively thinking about how you're learning, you're probably going to learn more effectively.
Exactly. And Improve has also been successful in collaborative problem-solving scenarios using computer algebra systems, for example. It led to improvements in algebraic thinking and metacognitive knowledge.
So it's a versatile technique that can be applied in different learning contexts.
Yeah, and it's been shown to improve procedural problem-solving skills, mathematical explanations, and self-monitoring strategies in math e-learning environments too.
Wow, so it's really well supported by the research.
It is now another approach is to simply train students on specific phases or areas of SRL, like teaching them how to set effective goals or how to monitor their understanding.
Okay, so it's like giving them the tools and techniques they need to self-regulate their learning.
Exactly. And this approach has also been shown to be effective, but the findings regarding self-monitoring prompts have been a bit mixed.
Self-monitoring prompts. Okay, so those are like little reminders that pop up in the CVLE to encourage learners to check their understanding.
Exactly. And sometimes they seem to work really well, but other times they don't seem to have much of an impact on learners' self-reported metacognitive awareness.
Interesting. So it's like learners might be getting the prompts, but they're not necessarily internalizing the message.
Yeah, and similarly, reflection prompts and feedback from automated tutors haven't always led to better learning outcomes in every study, although the mere presence of a tutor, regardless of the specific prompts used, does seem to enhance both self-regulation and external regulation, which is the ability to regulate your learning based on feedback from others.
Okay, so it seems like the design and implementation of these metacognitive supports is really important, and it's not always clear-cut what's going to work best.
Definitely. And that leads us to some of the key challenges and future directions for research in this field.
Right, we've talked about a lot of really interesting findings, but there are always more questions to explore.
Absolutely. So one major challenge is the lack of theoretical specificity in a lot of the research on SRL and CBLEs. Many studies just talk about SRL in a general sense without really grounding it in a specific theoretical framework.
Okay, so it's like everyone's speaking a slightly different language.
Yeah, and this can lead to inconsistencies in how key terms are defined and used, for example. Sometimes metacognition and SRL are used interchangeably, which can be confusing.
Right, it's like comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly. And even studies that do use similar theories might focus on different aspects of those theories, which makes it hard to get a comprehensive picture of how all the different pieces of SRL fit together.
So it's like everyone's looking at a different part of the elephant.
Yeah, and on top of that, many studies only focus on one specific area of SRL, like a particular learning strategy, rather than examining the whole cyclical process of planning, monitoring, reflecting, and adjusting.
Right, it's like trying to understand how a car works by just looking at the engine. You need to see how all the different parts interact with each other.
Exactly. And another big challenge is measurement. A lot of the research on SRL and CBLEs relies on self-report measures, which, as we discussed earlier, can be problematic.
Right, because people aren't always the best judges of their own learning processes.
Exactly. And there's also debate about the validity and reliability of some of the commonly used SRL instruments.
So it's like we're not even sure if we're measuring what we think we're measuring.
Yeah, and that's why there's a growing push to use multiple sources of data to get a more accurate picture of SRL, like combining self-report measures with trace data, instructor reports, think aloud protocols, and discourse analysis.
Okay, so it's about getting a more holistic view of SRL.
Exactly. And it's also important to consider the quality of SRL processes, not just whether they're occurring, like, is the learner setting effective goals? Are they accurately monitoring their understanding? And are they choosing appropriate strategies? And it's also important to capture the motivational processes involved in SRL, which can be tricky to do with think alouds.
Right, because motivation is like the fuel that drives the whole learning engine.
Exactly. And finally, it's crucial to remember that SRL is a dynamic process. It changes over time, so our measurement methods need to be sensitive to that.
Okay, so it's not a one-and-done kind of thing. It's an ongoing journey.
Exactly. Now, another issue that researchers are grappling with is the disconnect between SRL and learning outcomes.
Okay, so you'd think that if someone is good at self-regulating their learning, they would automatically learn more, but that's not always the case.
Right. A surprising number of studies on SRL and CBLEs don't even measure learning outcomes at all, which makes it hard to know how SRL is actually impacting learning. And even in studies that do measure learning, some of them have found differences in SRL processes without corresponding differences in learning outcomes.
That's so weird. It's like someone is following the recipe perfectly, but the cake still comes out flat.
Yeah, it's a puzzle, and it suggests that we need to dig deeper into understanding the relationship between SRL and learning.
Totally. And another really interesting question that's emerging is the blurring line between self-regulation and other regulation.
Right. In CBLEs, learners are often interacting with all sorts of supports, peers, tools, tutors, prompts. So how much of their learning regulation is truly self-initiated and how much is being driven by the environment?
That's a great question. It's like, are we really in control of our own learning, or are we just puppets dancing to the tune of the CBLE?
Yeah, and researchers are starting to explore this question more by looking at the concept of other regulated learning and the importance of fading those external supports over time to foster independent SRL.
Okay, so it's like we need to provide enough support to help learners get started, but then gradually remove that support so they can learn to stand on their own 2 feet.
Exactly. But knowing when and how to effectively fade that scaffolding is a real challenge.
Makes sense. It's a delicate balance. And finally, there's a growing recognition that the effectiveness of specific SRL processes might vary depending on the type of CBLE. Right? So what works well in a simulation might not work as well in a more linear multimedia presentation.
Exactly. And some research has already identified strategies that seem to be particularly relevant to certain types of CBLEs. So there's a need for more focused research that examines SRL within specific kinds of digital learning environments.
Okay, so it's all about context.
Exactly. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today.
It's been a real deep dive into SRL in CBLEs. So for our listeners who are still with us, what's the key takeaway here?
The most important thing to remember is that developing your SRL skills is absolutely crucial for success in online learning environments. These digital tools are incredibly powerful, but it's your ability to plan, monitor, adapt, and reflect that will ultimately determine how much you learn.
So it's not just about having access to the technology, it's about using it strategically and intentionally.
Exactly. And I encourage everyone to think about their own learning habits in digital environments. Are you setting goals? Are you checking your understanding? Are you trying out different strategies? And are you reflecting on what's working and what's not?
Those are great questions to ask yourself. And don't forget about the different supports we talked about today. Tools, conceptual aids, metacognitive strategies. Those can all help you enhance your SRL skills.
Absolutely. And as technology continues to evolve, our understanding of SRL will need to evolve too. It's an ongoing area of research with exciting implications for lifelong learning.
So true, and that's a great place to leave it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into SRL.
It's been a pleasure.